All right, well, look, we'll move on. And I guess some of the stuff I'm going to talk about here is going to feed into Josh's subsequent talk on the nitrogen environment. And there is a bit of an update later from Kyle, which one of us will probably co-present and talk through because Kyle can't be with us today. But look, where is this nitrogen situation? And it's something that we do need to reflect on. I guess there is a little bit of positivity out there that we may see a reduction in nitrogen prices as we move forward. But I guess we really, need to be very focused moving forward that this nitrogen is going to continue to be a challenge. If it does get a bit cheaper, I still think we're looking at long-term volatility in that nitrogen market, and we just need to start getting smarter and better with nitrogen. Now, this year is going to present some particular challenges with nitrogen, and we're going to touch that. And one of the things that we classically see when nitrogen prices get high and we get good pasture growth conditions, we tend to use a lot less of it, okay? And this has had a pretty big impact on the nitrogen pool in pastures and soils. So the high-cost nitrogen environment and the good conditions have said a lot of people, well, I don't need to grow more grass because that's been the focus on using nitrogen, is just what you grow. Now, I think it's important to focus on how much you grow, but also important to focus a little bit on the quality of what you grow. But what we're seeing generally is that there's been a lot less nitrogen used, and that's probably combining with a number of factors to really deplete our nitrogen pools in pastures, particularly in situations where we don't have a lot of legume in those pastures. So the strong grass growth has led to reduced applications. As people have started mulching and breaking down and slashing pastures to try and keep them under control, we actually get, in some situations, the net nitrogen loss in that situation because of trash decomposition. It actually chews up nitrogen at quite a high rate if you've got a lot of trash there to get that trash to decompose. Now, some of that, if it's incorporated into bacteria, can find its way into the soil and the soil situation. But again, we will lose some of that nitrogen as it's breaking down that trash to the atmosphere as well. And again, with the repeated rain events, I guess we've seen ongoing leaching occurring and where we've had waterlogging, denitrification. So again, look, it's been good because we've been able to reduce costs of nitrogen use because we've had good grass conditions. But I guess we are seeing a marked reduction in pasture quality. This is reducing production and feeding to things like milk protein as well. And that's pretty simple, as our pasture quality drops due to excessive growth, we get an increase in the fibre level, we get lower protein, lower levels of sugars and carbohydrates, less milk, lower milk protein, okay? So I guess one of the interesting things that we've seen, and Josh may have some comments here, is that we have a bit of less nitrogen being used on a lot of the farms. And whether or not it's because of that or just because of the cooler, wetter, sustained conditions, we're actually seeing a lot more clover growing naturally on a lot of the pastures. And some of the white clover that I've seen, particularly south of Sydney, has been extraordinary in paddocks where we just haven't seen it previously. So, I think we are seeing some good legume growth, particularly, I guess, for people who've worked to enhance it on their farm as part of their longer-term strategies. And that's helped with both pasture quality and in some situations, I'm pretty sure that will be feeding some nitrogen into the grass pool as well. But look, it really has been difficult to keep control of grazing rotations. People are trying to manage this with silage cutting with variable results. And unfortunately, we're getting that silage off a lot of time in between the wet weather, but, we are actually accumulating a lot of stacks of moderate to low quality silage that we're going to have to work out how to use later.
Neil, just on your clover point there, because I think it's really, really important, and something that, I guess I've been able to see over the last sort of 5 to 10 years is how that clover can come about. And this year, definitely due to the flooding we had and all that rain that we had in that autumn period, really sort of suppressed all of our summer pastures early. And we got a really good germination of clovers in that autumn winter period. I tend to see we end up with a lot more clover when we have a tougher or less summer pasture going into autumn, because it's able to germinate, get away and establish in the winter. When we have really good summer pasture, kikuyu growth that can go right into June, if we have those type of years, clover doesn't seem to be as good in the spring following, and that's just due to competition and those sorts of things. But also the other one, if you want good clover, is making sure that you get your grazing management right, so that if you do get a good establishment of clover through that winter period, that when you're in that spring period and you get that spring flush, that you're not letting it go past canopy closure and locking paddocks up and not allowing that clover to be able to see the light as well, can have a big impact. But yeah, definitely, reiterate your points about that grazing rotations. It's been a very challenging year. It's basically been raining nearly every week. So trying to cut silage is difficult. And then when people want to cut it at the right time to make quality, typically it's been delayed a couple of weeks due to the conditions, which is sort of creating exactly what you said, a lot more silage that could be a bit lower quality that you need to mark and work out how you're going to use.
No, I think that's spot on, Josh. And look, we'll continue to touch on some of those issues as we move forward. I think, that those autumn and summer reflections are really important, I think, on those seasonal conditions. And I guess that white clover, it's amazing how it can continue to spread, not just from seed, but from solaniferous growth if you can have a bit of openness in that canopy. So moving forward, I guess, how do we go about this valuing nitrogen? And I guess it's really important to look at this reasonably holistically, because I think we have a very linear way of normally thinking about it, just saying, well, the only value is on the dry matter that we produce. And I guess that's important because ultimately, that's our immediate return on spending some money now is what we get in response to it. Well, look, those dry matter responses can still be extremely good. We know that if we were chasing feed from Kikuyu at the moment, putting nitrogen on is going to give us incredibly efficient nitrogen use efficiency, up 20 kilos plus of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen applied, potentially higher than that. But it's not the only thing that we need to think about. We actually need to think about those issues such as pasture quality, and in particular protein and digestibility. So, we're in a pretty hot protein market at the moment. Our canola meals are approaching $500 a tonne or higher. But it's pretty rare that you actually hear about people valuing the protein in their pastures. And again, we know that we can manipulate the protein levels in pasture with nitrogen, and that has considerable value that we need to consider over and above the dry matter responses. It is generally the lower cost source of rumen available protein by far, and we know that a significant amount of pasture protein is also bypass protein as well, depending on pasture quality. So I think we shouldn't underestimate that response and refine it to totally the dry matter response. I think we also need to reflect on the impact of nitrogen at the right time in various crops and pastures over their life cycle. Okay, so timely applications of nitrogen at the right time, particularly at establishment, okay, and in that early season, can ensure that we get much stronger plants with better root development, better tillering, better competition against weeds, okay, at that front end, which means that we have a much more responsive, stronger plant as we move into winter. It's going to be more responsive to all other inputs and more resilient. It's going to actually be more drought tolerant because it will have developed a better root system, and we will move to drought again at some stage, just as likely as we've moved to flood. But again, if we've got a stronger plant, it's going to be more responsive to all stresses that it receives. So, and then as we move into winter, a strong plant in winter will respond more to things like gibberellic acid and things like additional nitrogen if we choose to use that during that winter period. So, thinking about that bit of nitrogen at the front end with respect to its importance for crop establishment. This is a really good photo that we took a number of years ago, where the left side received a small application of nitrogen shortly after planting and the right hand missed it, okay? It had a profound impact on that pasture right through the season, okay, not just at the front end. So what are our alternatives to not using pasture? We're not using nitrogen. Sorry, guys. Let's get there. One of our alternatives that we end up with no feed. Okay, so we need to then think about, well, what's that value if we actually have to replace it? And it's generally quite different to what people perceive. And I'll take people through an exercise on that shortly. Ryegrass pasture is not wheat hay. Okay, and wheat hay is not ryegrass pasture. You can't just say, well, I can replace it with one fodder compared to another. Standard wheat hays this year are likely to be above 8.5 megajoule of energy, maybe 9 if you're lucky. Very high fibre, very low protein. So to say that I can buy hay for 25 cents a kilogram and replace my grass with it, it just doesn't stack up. All right. We can accept low quality feed and silage, okay, if we don't use fertiliser, and that's very much the situation which we're dealing with now. And look, that might be fine. That might be a rational decision for some people to say, I'm quite happy to have that lower quality feed. We've still got to think about what are the downstream implications of having that low quality feed and what do we do with them later. We can look at purchase feed equivalents, and we'll do a costing exercise on that shortly. And again, if we miss nitrogen at those key times, if we don't put it in as our starter or shortly after, we can risk poor establishment, persistence, and lost opportunity later in the cycle. Okay, and I think it's really important when we're thinking about, our inputs now to reflect on what implications that might have on inputs as we move further in time. All right. So look, here's just a bit of a worksheet that we've gone through in the past, and this really values this cost of additional forage dry matter grown, and I'll repeat, grown at this stage. Okay. At different urea prices at different rates of nitrogen use efficiency. All right. So what we're out to do generally is to get into what we call this zone of high efficiency. And this is where we're getting responses in excess of 15 kilograms of dry matter per hectare of nitrogen applied. And what you can basically see, as we move down a scale of costs from $1,100 a tonne to $2,000 a tonne, we're operating at that high zone. These are the costs of extra pasture grown as a result of that nitrogen. All right. So again, at that 1100 zone, the response, if we're operating even at 15, 20, 25 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen response. So these aren't going to be the responses that we get down in southern Victoria, okay, in the middle of winter. These are the responses that we classically see, Josh, and you might add to this, on our warmer grasses in winter and spring in particular, and in autumn when things are going really well, in those warmer environments, particularly in our Italian ryegrass systems and annual ryegrass systems. We are getting and measuring these responses up in our northern areas. At that 1700 level, which is sort of where it is around now, we're still coming in at that 15 kilo response rate of 246, at 20, 185, at 25, $148 a tonne dry matter. I mean, importantly, it does drop off precipitously, when we get down in this zone here, all right? And if you've got poor nitrogen use practices, sparse pastures, wrong thing being fertilised at the wrong time of year, not enough moisture or too much moisture present, okay, poor fertility across the rest of the fertility package, and again, Josh will talk on that total fertility package later, okay? It can become incredibly expensive to put nitrogen on if you're operating down in these zones here, all right? But if your whole farming system's in the right place, these are typically the responses that we are getting with nitrogen use, in the short to medium term. Josh, did you want to make any comments on that?
No, Neil, I just agree with everything you're saying, mate, and definitely we can get those responses. I guess the other side of this is the question: do you need feed? So if we do need feed, these are the responses we can get if you've got a pasture that's going to respond, and there's good moisture around, and that's what you can do. The harder question, which I'm still trying to, I've got my gut feelings around it now, and I guess I use some rule of thumb things, but it'd be nice to see a bit more hard data on is that quality discussion. And I'm seeing a lot of summer pastures that are really, deficient, and they've got growth there and they don't need the feed and they don't need any extra feed. But the questions I've got is, should we be applying, not normally would apply 30 to 40 kilos of N. Should we be applying 10 to 15 or 20 kilos of N just to try and maintain quality? Rather than trying to grow, we're not trying to grow more feed, but can we just try and hold that protein level up for that production side of it, Neil? So that's a question I'll open up to Peter and yourselves and everyone else.
No, and look, I guess we're looking at that now by progressively over the next 2 weeks, I guess, starting to take some of that pasture out of the system for early planting or other purposes. And I guess getting our clients increasingly focused on managing the component of their summer pastures more intensively that they're going to retain till the end of March or the end of April, because quite often we'll be doing a split planting.
Yep.
We're getting some stuff going early. And again, we'll talk a bit about that later. But the stuff that we're retaining, we're sort of saying, well, it's an important time now to probably get those pastures mulched right down. Okay, clean up that base so we're not growing more rubbish on top of rubbish, and probably coming in with some fertiliser now, because we know that the response is actually going to be quite good, but it's also going to improve the quality as we move into late February and March of that late season summer grass-based pastures.
And Neil, just to add to that, and Peter, you could probably comment to this, Peter Bill, that is, the carryover effect that we can get to. So if we start to use some nitrogen now, especially if we have, started depleting the soil in terms of that organic matter buildup, is there a bit of a carryover of some of that nitrogen from we've seen from some of Pete's research that you will get, some of that nitrogen being available or, being mineralised so that it's available for when we do plant pastures, Pete?
Yeah, look, the work we did at James Neal showed that there is some carryover between grazings. A little bit different because we were in a cut and carry situation where we took the pasture away, but there's definitely been a number of trials that if you apply fertiliser this grazing, it does carry on to the next, but it's not huge. But I think the important thing is that if we want to keep growing pasture at a certain growth rate, it needs nitrogen. And when you do skip or you delay applying nitrogen, you're going to reduce your growth rate. So it's not something you can just hope that's going to happen. It will definitely drop if the nitrogen's not there. So I think the key is that we've got wherever you've got moisture and you keep applying nitrogen, you're maintaining a really good growth rate, predictable growth rate, and you can, we can plan on that. Whereas when you start dropping out nitrogen, you're slowing the growth rate. You're never quite sure where you're up to. So having to readjust can be a problem. So that, yeah. And I think the other thing to mention was that the nitrogen we applied to, say, Kikuyu at this time of year never really impacted on ryegrass establishment. If anything, and we see this a lot, that ryegrass needs that fertility, and both, if you manage the grazing a bit, the nitrogen applied to the Kikuyu actually improves ryegrass establishment. And I know that's a bit contrary.
The impact is positive.
Yeah, that's contrary to what's been said in the past, but I think we understand a lot more about how to manage Kikuyu growth rate. And obviously, if your paddock you just can't get to, it gets out of control, well, that it's failed. But if you're keeping on top of it and maintaining that fertility, you get a better transition, quicker transition to ryegrass. And I think that's what Neil's saying, is that it does improve the Kikuyu quality, but it also gets quicker transition to the more dominant ryegrass in May, and that improves quality too. So,
yeah, no, precisely, Pete. Now we'll keep probably moving, Josh, because we've got a bit to get through still. Look, this is just an exercise that I did for an irrigation project down in Bega a number of years ago. But basically, we tried, and it's extremely difficult to replicate a kilogram of grass or a ton of dry matter of pasture, and look at what that's really going to cost. So we look at a high quality pasture that'll be 10.5 megajoule plus, 20% greater protein, 40%, 43 or 44% NDF. And you try and replicate it, but the only thing you can replicate that with a single feed that you can buy is very, very high quality lucerne hay. So, if we look at what that looks like, and this is where these recosting exercises are important. If we buy it for $350 a tonne landed, we account for the dry matter in it, and then we look at 15% wastage, which is probably conservative lucerne. What they actually eat is going to be consumed at about $457 a tonne dry matter. Okay, so that's starting to make even that higher cost pasture as an alternate to something like high quality lucerne hay look pretty good. That doesn't mean we don't use that high quality lucerne hay either. There'll be times where that's absolutely appropriate. But when we say, well, we're not going to bother fertilising grass, even if we're a bit short because of the cost of fertiliser, it's really, really important to couch that with reference to what a realistic alternative looks by the time you pay for dry matter and wastage as well. Similarly, if you do a pool diet, and this is sort of as close as we could get, we still didn't get high enough on the protein, and that was with about 25% wheat, 27% canola, about 50% cereal hay, and that was a reasonably high quality cereal hay. We still couldn't get near it, and that was still costing us about $430, $450 a tonne dry matter by the time you looked at it. Okay, so very, very high quality pasture is extraordinarily difficult to replicate at even, really high nitrogen costs. It still stands up. All right, so this is important, particularly when the alternate to pasture is thin air. Okay, and you're actually genuinely short of feed. If you have the option to switch that up with nitrogen, particularly if you can have moderate to good nitrogen use efficiency, it will really stand up compared to buying other feeds in general. All right. All right, we're just on that transition again, Joshy. There we go. So look, I think we also need to consider with nitrogen use efficiency, we've always talked about agronomic efficiency, okay, but I think it's important when we're thinking about nitrogen as well, just to move outside of that agronomic space to look at our whole system efficiency, because we can grow a heap of pasture at really high nitrogen use efficiency, all right, and look, the things that will drive that, again, a right crop, right pasture, right time of year, not too wet, not too dry, timing, generally we want to put our nitrogen on very early in the cropping cycle or the growth cycle of that rotation, where our other nutrients are in balance, and things like plant density, all right? But we also need to think, okay, about this whole systems level efficiency. Agronomic efficiency is really good, okay, but if we're not utilising the forage that we're growing effectively, if we've got poor grazing management practices and we're underutilising that forage, wasting it, leaving a lot of it in the paddock, spending a lot of money putting it in hay or silage and then feeding that out in the ground and wasting 25-30% of it, all of a sudden that incremental benefit we've gained from nitrogen input has come at a very, very high cost because of feed wastage. Similarly, we need to be thinking about things like actually ration balance and avoiding excessive protein in diets, which means that we end up with a lot of that nitrogen being excreted in urine or in dung. Okay, so looking at the carbohydrate side of the diet, making sure that the feed delivery and that the diets are balanced is really, really important. Okay, because then it's a loss of nitrogen to our farming system. It hasn't been converted into milk protein. All right, and similarly, it can have environmental impacts, and it's just generally very, very inefficient. So, we need to continually be moving towards higher feed conversion efficiency systems that improve, in turn, nitrogen use efficiency. If we're growing our grass at high efficiency, but our feed conversion efficiency is 1.2 litres compared to 1.5 litres for every kilogram of dry matter fed, okay, it's a very, very strong impact on that actual nitrogen use efficiency and how it's actually reflected in your total feed system. Similarly, we need to look at farm systems that return as much urea and manure nitrogen to the pasture or crop ecosystem. Okay, and this is efficient effluent capture and reuse systems. It includes simple things like water infrastructure, and that's cow water infrastructure. Making sure that you've actually got troughs in your paddocks has got a big impact in this stuff. If all your troughs are sitting in commons or in laneways and there's no water in the paddock, these cows will come out of the paddock and do a lot of their urinating and manure, okay, in laneways and around those water troughs, as opposed into the paddock where that nitrogen can be efficiently returned into the pasture ecosystem. Similarly, good laneways, a huge issue. If we've got poor quality laneways and we're still suffering after the floods with a lot of our laneways still not being repaired, and we've wet weather around the corner or in the middle of it already, if we've got poor quality laneways and cows are slow, a lot of that time spent in the paddock is now being replicated by time being spent in the laneway where we do not capture any of that nutrient and reuse it efficiently. So, the systems level thinking about nitrogen use has to be superimposed and used in combination with the agronomic efficiency to make sure our whole system is being driven appropriately. So look, realities, all right? Legumes offer substantial opportunity for reducing nitrogen use, but they do have some limitations. we're actually lacking research in this space and how they fit into modern coastal dairy systems. So look, I think, you know, if there are opportunities to fund and support research into how we better integrate legumes into our pasture systems in coastal areas, I think, you know, that's going to be money well spent, both in the annual systems and the perennial systems. I think our nitrogen costs, yes, there might be a bit of good news on the horizon, but they're going to be volatile. May move to some form of national self-sufficiency. We're still going to be in a market. Okay, so we might have a self-sufficient production, but if there's huge demand inland, we're still going to be competing with cropping nitrogen and other supply chain issues. I think we're going to be increasingly scrutinised on how we use nitrogen on farm, and the potential for auditing and control of nitrogen use is a reality as we move forward. Okay, so while we're seeing this in New Zealand already, okay, then I think we just, you know, we don't necessarily need to be scared, but we need to be prepared. Okay, that we are going to be further scrutinised on this as we move forward. In most enterprises, we need to use, we should be looking at nitrogen use practices at the agronomic level, but also at the systems level to make sure our efficiency is high. And this perception on value of nitrogen and other feed inputs also needs to be recalibrated with the shifts we have seen in milk and beef prices. So look, just briefly, you know, if you use 1,700 a tonne, high nitrogen use efficiency at 20 kilos, a kilogram of extra dry matter is worth 18.5 cents. If we utilise 75% of that, the consumed dry matter is worth about 25 cents. Our range of response at 65 cents a litre is going to depend on the system and the cows, but it could be anywhere between 1 and 2 litres per cow for that response. That could be 65 cents to $1.30 in exchange for the 25 cents we've spent. So we need to consider if it's substitution or additive to the base when reviewing what we're doing, and not just consider the dry matter, but also the energetics and the protein implications. Put that in the space of a beef pasture, and this is where some really interesting numbers on current beef markets come up. You know, we talk classically about 7 kilos of dry matter for a kilogram of live weight, and there can be variable around that. But our cost of a kilogram of live weight gain is $1.75 a kilo. And I guess that looks pretty interesting to me when our Eastern Young Cattle Indicator is well above $10 per kilogram dress weight at the moment. So I'll leave that one with people to ponder and yeah, any questions, or we can move on.